At 6:44 inches the morning, right outside a bustling midtown Manhattan hotel, a powerful CEO collapsed in mere seconds. What sent chills down investigators' spines were 3 words left at the scene. If you want to follow every twist and turn of this case as new details emerge, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any updates on this story that has captivated the nation. On the morning of December 4th, 2024, the sidewalks of Midtown Manhattan were already filling with early commuters, yellow cabs cutting through the cold winter air, and hotel guests streaming in and out of the New York Hilton Midtown. Among them was Brian Thompson, a 50-year-old executive who had risen to become the CEO of United Healthcare, the largest private health insurance company in the United States. Thompson was not just any corporate executive. He was a man whose decisions affected tens of millions of Americans. A figure who represented the immense power and influence of the healthcare industry. To the public, he appeared calm, professional, and thoroughly in control of an empire worth billions. Brian Thompson's journey to the top had been methodical and impressive. He had spent over 2 decades climbing the ranks within United Health Group, demonstrating a sharp business acumen and an ability to navigate the complex world of health insurance. Colleagues described him as disciplined and strategic, someone who understood both the numbers and the politics of healthcare. He lived in a comfortable suburban home in Minnesota with his wife and children, maintaining a relatively low public profile despite his powerful position. To those who knew him personally, he was a devoted family man who tried to balance the demands of running a massive corporation with the responsibilities of fatherhood. His annual compensation package ran into the millions, placing him among the highest-paid executives in the healthcare sector. But on that December morning, as Thompson prepared to attend United Healthcare's annual investor conference at the Hilton, he had no idea that his life was about to end in the most shocking and public way imaginable. The attack happened with brutal efficiency. At approximately 6:45 a.m., just steps from the hotel entrance, a figure emerged from the shadows. The individual was dressed in a dark jacket and wore a mask that concealed most of his face. He had been waiting, positioned in a spot that gave him a clear line of sight to the hotel's front entrance, while remaining partially hidden from the street. Surveillance cameras would later reveal that this person had arrived in the area well before Thompson, suggesting careful planning and reconnaissance. As Brian Thompson walked along the sidewalk, likely reviewing notes for his presentation or checking messages on his phone, the masked figure moved with purpose. In one swift motion, he drew a handgun equipped with a suppressor, a device designed to muffle the sound of gunfire. The weapon was raised, aimed at Thompson's back, and the trigger was pulled. The first shot struck Thompson, causing him to stumble forward. Then something unexpected happened. The gun jammed. For a few critical seconds, the shooter remained calm, working to clear the malfunction with practiced movements. Once the weapon was operational again, he fired multiple additional rounds into Thompson's back and legs, ensuring that his target would not survive. Brian Thompson collapsed onto the pavement, blood pooling around him as pedestrians began to scream and scatter. The entire attack lasted less than 30 seconds. The shooter did not linger to admire his work or make any statement. Instead, he turned and ran into a nearby alley, moving with the same calculated precision that had characterized the shooting itself. Witnesses reported seeing him mount a bicycle and pedal away rapidly, disappearing into the maze of streets that eventually led to Central Park. Within minutes, he had vanished into one of the most surveilled cities in the world, leaving behind a scene of chaos and a victim who would be pronounced dead shortly after arriving at the hospital. What investigators discovered at the crime scene would turn this from a shocking murder into something far more complex and disturbing. Scattered on the ground near Thompson's body were several shell casings, the brass remnants of the bullets that had been fired. But these were no ordinary casings. Each one bore an engraved word. The words were delay, deny, and depose. These 3 terms were immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with the health insurance industry. They represented a common criticism leveled against insurance companies, a shorthand for the tactics allegedly used to avoid paying out claims. Delay processing. deny coverage, and depose or remove patients from care. The message was unmistakable. This was not a random act of violence or a robbery gone wrong. This was a targeted assassination with a political or ideological dimension. The engraved shell casings suggested that the killer wanted to send a message, not just to Brian Thompson, but to the entire healthcare industry, and perhaps to the American public. It implied that Thompson's death was meant to symbolize something larger, a statement about the perceived injustices of the health insurance system. The discovery sent shockwaves through law enforcement and the media. Suddenly, this was not just a murder investigation but a case that touched on deep social and political tensions. As detectives combed through surveillance footage from dozens of cameras around Midtown Manhattan, a picture began to emerge of the shooter's movements. He had walked through the area earlier that morning, appearing to conduct final preparations. After the shooting, he had moved quickly but not frantically, following what seemed to be a pre-planned escape route. The bicycle he used was later found abandoned in Central Park, along with a backpack that contained items of interest to investigators, though authorities were careful about what details they released to the public. The manhunt that followed was massive and urgent. The FBI joined the New York Police Department in the search, bringing federal resources to bear. Tips poured in from across the country as images of the suspect, though partially obscured by his mask, were broadcast on every news channel and shared millions of times on social media. Investigators interviewed hotel staff, reviewed traffic camera footage, and traced digital footprints. They knew they were looking for someone who was intelligent, methodical, and had likely harbored intense anger toward the health insurance industry. For several days, the trail seemed to go cold. The shooter had been careful, avoiding clear facial shots and leaving minimal physical evidence. But then came the break that would crack the case wide open, and it came from an unexpected source in an unexpected place. 5 days after the murder, hundreds of miles away in the small town of Altoona, Pennsylvania, a young employee at a McDonald's restaurant was working the morning shift. It was a routine day, customers coming and going, orders being called out. The familiar rhythm of fast food service. Then a man walked in, alone, carrying a laptop bag. He ordered food and sat down at a table, opening his computer as if he were just another traveler stopping for breakfast. But something about him caught the employee's attention. Perhaps it was the way he kept his head down, or the nervous energy that seemed to emanate from him despite his attempt to appear casual. The employee had seen the news coverage, had looked at the photos of the wanted suspect that were plastered across every media outlet, and suddenly, sitting just a few tables away, was someone who looked remarkably similar. The employee made a decision that would change the course of the investigation. Quietly, without drawing attention, he contacted local police. Within minutes, officers arrived at the McDonald's. Approaching the man carefully, they asked for identification, and what they found was startling. The man presented documents, but they appeared to be fraudulent. When officers searched him and his belongings, they discovered items that immediately linked him to the New York shooting. There was a handgun, consistent with the weapon used in Thompson's murder, complete with a suppressor. There were fake identification cards bearing different names, and perhaps most chilling of all, there was a handwritten document, several pages long, that investigators would later describe as a manifesto. The man sitting in that McDonald's, the person who had allegedly executed Brian Thompson in cold blood on a Manhattan sidewalk, was identified as Luigi Mangione, a 26-year-old from Maryland. And as details about his background emerged, the case took yet another unexpected turn. Luigi Mangione was not the hardened criminal or marginalized outsider that many might have expected. Instead, he came from a prominent and wealthy family with deep roots in the Baltimore area. The Mangione family was well known in Maryland, with successful business ventures and philanthropic activities. Luigi himself had been an exceptional student, graduating as valedictorian from an elite private high school. He had gone on to attend the University of Pennsylvania, an Ivy League institution, where he studied computer science and mathematics. By all outward appearances, he was someone with every advantage, someone destined for success and comfort. Friends and former classmates expressed shock at the news of his arrest. They remembered him as brilliant, thoughtful, and socially aware. He had been interested in technology, philosophy, and social issues. There had been no obvious signs that he was capable of violence, let alone planning and executing a targeted assassination. But as investigators dug deeper into his recent history, a different picture began to emerge. In the months and years leading up to the shooting, Mangione had apparently undergone a significant personal transformation. He had suffered from chronic back pain, the result of a spinal condition that had caused him considerable suffering. Those who knew him said the pain had been debilitating at times, affecting his ability to work and enjoy life. He had sought treatment, navigating the complex world of health insurance, medical approvals, and coverage decisions. It appeared that his experiences with the healthcare system had been frustrating and painful, both literally and figuratively. Whether his insurance claims had been denied, whether he had faced delays in getting necessary treatment, or whether he had simply been ground down by the bureaucratic machinery of healthcare, it seemed that these experiences had radicalized him. The manifesto found in his possession painted a picture of deep resentment toward corporate America and specifically toward health insurance companies. The document railed against what the author perceived as the greed and cruelty of an industry that profited from human suffering. It expressed contempt for executives who made millions while patients struggled to get care. It framed the killing of Brian Thompson not as murder but as a form of justice, a necessary action to draw attention to systemic problems. The writing was articulate and structured, the work of an educated mind that had concluded that violence was a justified response to what it saw as institutional violence. When Mangione was extradited back to New York to face charges, the legal proceedings began under intense public scrutiny. The courthouse was surrounded by media trucks and satellite dishes. Security was extraordinarily tight, with officers from multiple agencies forming a protective cordon. Inside the courtroom, Mangione appeared in an orange jumpsuit, his hands shackled. He looked younger than his 26 years. His expression a mixture of defiance and resignation. The prosecution laid out its case with methodical precision. They argued that this was a premeditated, first-degree murder. Luigi Mangione had researched Brian Thompson, had learned his schedule, had traveled to New York specifically to carry out the assassination. He had purchased or manufactured the firearm used in the attack, a so-called ghost gun that could be assembled from parts and was difficult to trace. He had practiced, planned, and executed the killing with cold calculation. The evidence was substantial. There was the gun recovered from him, ballistics testing that would determine if it matched the bullets that killed Thompson. There was surveillance footage placing someone matching his description at the scene. There were the fake IDs, suggesting consciousness of guilt and an attempt to evade capture. And there was the manifesto, a written admission of his motivations, if not a direct confession to the act itself. The defense team faced an uphill battle. Their client had not entered a plea of guilty, maintaining his right to a defense. His attorneys argued that some of the evidence had been obtained improperly, that certain procedures had been violated during his arrest and the search of his belongings. They suggested that the manifesto was merely the expression of political views, protected speech that did not constitute an admission of criminal conduct. They raised questions about whether the gun could definitively be linked to the crime, about whether witnesses could reliably identify their client, about whether the prosecution could prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Luigi Mangione was the person who pulled the trigger on that December morning. The courtroom debates were intense and technical. Legal experts weighed in on the admissibility of evidence, on the standards for proving intent, on the difference between expressing anger at a system and committing murder. The judge presided carefully, aware that every decision would be scrutinized and potentially appealed. Key rulings were postponed to later hearings, stretching the legal process out over weeks and months. Outside the courtroom, public reaction was deeply divided and troubling in its complexity. Some people expressed horror at the murder and sympathy for Brian Thompson's family, seeing the killing as an inexcusable act of violence regardless of the killer's grievances. Others, however, responded with a disturbing level of support for Mangione, viewing him as a folk hero who had struck back against a system they despised. Social media filled with posts praising the assassination, with memes celebrating the 3 words engraved on the shell casings, with donations to legal defense funds. The case had touched a nerve in American society, revealing just how deep the frustration and anger toward the healthcare industry ran. This reaction sparked intense debate among commentators, ethicists, and political leaders. Some argued that the response demonstrated the urgent need for healthcare reform, that when a segment of the population celebrated murder, it was a sign of profound societal dysfunction. Others warned that romanticizing political violence was dangerous, that it could inspire copycat attacks and erode the foundations of civil society. The case became a flashpoint in larger discussions about inequality, corporate power, the cost of healthcare, and the limits of peaceful protest. The legal proceedings continued, with both sides preparing for what would likely be a lengthy trial. If convicted of first-degree murder, Luigi Mangione faced the possibility of life in prison without parole, and in some jurisdictions, potentially even capital punishment. The stakes could not be higher, both for him personally and for the symbolic weight the case had taken on. As the case moved forward, numerous questions remained unresolved. What exactly had Luigi Mangione experienced in his interactions with health insurance companies that had driven him to such extremes? Had he personally been denied coverage for his spinal condition? Or was his anger more abstract, based on what he saw as the broader injustices of the system? How long had he been planning the attack? And had he considered other targets before settling on Brian Thompson? The timeline of his movements in the days leading up to the shooting was still being pieced together by investigators. There were also questions about the evidence itself. If the defense succeeded in getting key pieces of evidence suppressed, how would prosecutors build their case? Could they rely on circumstantial evidence, on the pattern of behavior, on the manifesto, even if the gun was excluded? What would witnesses be able to testify to? And how reliable would their identifications be given that the shooter had been masked? Perhaps most fundamentally, the case raised questions that extended far beyond the courtroom. What happens when individuals lose faith in institutions? When they believe that the system is so broken that violence is the only way to be heard? How should society respond to grievances against powerful corporations when legal and political channels seem ineffective? And where is the line between legitimate criticism of an industry and the kind of radicalization that leads to murder? Brian Thompson's death left behind a grieving family, colleagues who were traumatized by the sudden loss, and an industry that was forced to confront uncomfortable truths about how it was perceived by the public. His children had lost a father, his wife a husband, not because of an accident or illness, but because someone had decided that he represented something worthy of death. Whatever the flaws of the health insurance system, whatever the legitimate criticisms that could be made, there was no question that Thompson himself was a human being, not merely a symbol. The case also left a mark on American society that would not easily fade. The 3 words engraved on those shell casings had become a rallying cry for some, a symbol of resistance against corporate power, but they also represented a crossing of a line, the translation of anger and frustration into lethal violence. In a democracy, change is supposed to come through votes, through organizing, through persuasion and legislation. When people conclude that those mechanisms have failed and that violence is justified, the entire social fabric is at risk. As the legal process continued, with court dates scheduled months into the future and appeals likely to drag on for years, the question hanging over everything was whether this case would serve as a wake-up call or a precedent. Would it spur meaningful reforms in how healthcare is delivered and financed in America? Or would it simply inspire others who felt similarly aggrieved to take matters into their own hands? The answer would depend not just on what happened in the courtroom, but on how American society chose to respond to the deep discontent that the case had laid bare. The killing of Brian Thompson in those few seconds on a December morning had opened a wound in the American consciousness. How that wound would heal, or whether it would fester and spread, remained to be seen. What was certain was that the 3 words left at the scene would not be forgotten, and that the questions they raised about justice, power, and the limits of civilized society would continue to echo long after the trial reached its conclusion. In the end, a functioning society must offer pathways for grievances to be heard and addressed without resorting to violence. When those pathways fail or are perceived to fail, the consequences can be tragic for everyone involved. The rule of law exists not to protect the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable, but to ensure that conflicts are resolved through reason and justice rather than through force. Whatever one's views on healthcare or corporate power, the answer cannot lie in assassination. It must lie in the hard work of democratic reform, in holding institutions accountable through lawful means, and in remembering that behind every title and position is a human life that cannot be reduced to a symbol. What do you think the three words left at the scene truly represent? A personal motive, a political message, or something else entirely? Share your thoughts in the comments based on the facts presented, and subscribe to stay updated as this case continues to unfold and the court makes its crucial decisions on evidence and justice.